"Sir, give me a job." The words cracked through the silence like a thunderclap, sharp and trembling, carrying both fear and defiance. A young girl, barely out of her teens, stood in front of a massive oak desk polished to perfection. Her small fists clenched as she slammed down a crumpled resume. The paper was wrinkled and worn, as though it had survived countless rejections, as though every crease held a story of despair. Her voice quivered, but her eyes, those eyes burned with something stronger than fear. "While you sit here counting your millions, my mother is dying. She's dying without medicine, and I can't just stand by anymore." The office froze. High above the city, the glass walls reflected the skyline, but inside the room, power and desperation clashed head-on. The silence was almost unbearable. On one side stood a titan of industry, a man who had built empires with contracts, deals, and ruthlessness. On the other, a fragile figure with nothing to her name but determination, rage, and a single piece of paper that held her last hope. The millionaire's fingers moved slowly as he reached for the resume. His expression was unreadable, carved from years of negotiation and command. Yet, as his eyes moved across the words, something within him shifted. The armor of wealth and authority seemed to crack, ever so slightly. For what he read was not just a resume, it was a story. What would you do? If you were in his place, would you dismiss her as just another desperate soul? Or would you pause, listen, and risk seeing a reflection of yourself in her courage? The hum of the city far below filled the silence of the 38th floor. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The story begins not with power, but with pain. This girl had grown up in places no millionaire would ever step foot into. Her childhood was a string of half meals, nights spent worrying about bills, and mornings filled with fear of eviction. Yet, despite it all, she had learned to fight. She had learned to smile when life gave her no reason to. She had learned to dream even when the world told her dreams were for the privileged. And now, standing in that towering office, she had nothing left to lose. Her mother's illness was progressing fast. Hospitals demanded money, pharmacies demanded money, and life demanded money she simply did not have. Jobs had been scarce, opportunities scarcer still. Each rejection letter had been like another nail in the coffin of her hope, but she refused to stop. She refused to let her mother die without trying everything, even if it meant walking into the lion's den, the CEO's office, and throwing down her demand. "Please," she whispered now, softer, though no less fierce. "Just give me a chance. I'll do anything. I'll prove myself. Just don't turn me away." The man leaned back in his leather chair, the resume still in his hands. For the first time in years, he was speechless. This man was no ordinary CEO. He was a figure of legend in the business world, the type of man newspapers called a self-made visionary. His empire stretched across industries, technology, real estate, finance. To the outside world, he was untouchable. He had risen from modest beginnings, or so the magazines claimed, but the truth was that he had long forgotten the taste of struggle. The years had hardened him, polished him, until only results mattered. People were numbers, employees were tools, and compassion was a liability. And yet, this girl shook something loose inside him. Her resume wasn't impressive in the conventional sense. It didn't boast Ivy League degrees or glamorous internships. Instead, it listed survival jobs, waitressing, cleaning, tutoring younger kids just to scrape together rent. But written between the lines, if one looked closely, there was grit, there was resilience, there was fire. It was a resume not of privilege, but of persistence. He found himself reading it twice, then a third time, almost unwilling to put it down. Each word seemed to whisper, "She deserves a chance." But power does not yield easily. "Do you even know what you're asking?" he finally said, his voice low and deliberate. "This isn't charity. This is my company. We don't just hand out jobs because someone begs for one." Her chin lifted, defiance flashing in her eyes. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. I'll earn it. I'll stay up all night if I have to. I'll take every task you throw at me. But I won't walk away while my mother lies in bed waiting for me to save her." For a moment, silence hung between them again. Outside the glass walls the city buzzed, unaware that inside a battle of wills was unfolding. The CEO saw something in her that unsettled him. She was reminding him of a time he had buried deep, a time when he too had stood before doors that refused to open, when he too had been hungry, desperate, and invisible. He had promised himself never to go back there. And yet, here was this girl, dragging those memories back into the light. This wasn't just another meeting. It was a collision between wealth and poverty, between apathy and desperation, between a man who thought he had seen it all and a girl who still believed she could change her fate. Her resume sat on his desk, small and unimpressive in the material sense, but heavy with meaning. It was more than a list of jobs. It was a cry for help, a cry for dignity, a cry that said, "I matter too." The CEO exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had faced mergers worth billions, boardroom battles that made headlines, negotiations that determined the fate of entire industries. Yet none of those moments felt as heavy as this one, because this time it wasn't about numbers. It was about humanity. He looked up at her again. Her shoulders trembled, though she tried to stand tall. Her hands clenched and unclenched nervously, but her eyes never wavered. She was scared, yes, but she was unbreakable. And, for the first time in decades, the man wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was looking at someone who could teach him something he had forgotten long ago. The question remained, what would he do? Would he close his heart and dismiss her like all the others before him? Or would he risk something rarer than money, rarer than power? He would risk giving someone a chance. The story was only just beginning. The silence in that towering office stretched on, heavy like a storm cloud that refused to burst. The CEO tapped his fingers against the resume, his gaze locked on the words as though they carried a weight he hadn't expected. For years, his decisions had been swift, sharp, and unquestioned. Deals were struck in seconds, fortunes made in moments, and empires built on choices that never wavered. But now, facing this trembling girl who dared to challenge him, he hesitated. "You think determination is enough?" His voice finally broke the silence, deep and commanding, echoing off the glass walls. "This company isn't a playground. It's war. People with degrees from the best schools beg to work here, and they still don't make the cut. And you, what do you have to offer me? A story of pity?" The girl didn't flinch. She inhaled, steadying her breath, and her eyes grew sharper. "No, I have something stronger. I have the will to fight when everyone else gives up. I know how to work when I'm exhausted, how to learn when no one is willing to teach me, how to survive when the world says I shouldn't. That resume may not look like much to you, but every line is a battle I won. And if you give me a chance, I'll fight harder than anyone else in this building." Her words were not polished. They didn't sound like the carefully rehearsed speeches of candidates he had interviewed before. But there was a rawness, a sincerity that pierced through the sterile luxury of that office. For a fleeting moment, the CEO's mask slipped. He remembered a younger version of himself, hungry, rejected, standing outside doors that never opened. But memory was dangerous, and he quickly shoved it aside, his tone sharpening once again. "Why should I risk my empire on you?" he asked coldly. She stepped closer, her small frame dwarfed by the enormity of the desk, yet somehow filling the room with her presence. "Because if you don't, you'll never know what you're missing. You've built your empire on numbers, but sometimes numbers lie. Sometimes the best investment you can make is in someone no one else believes in. I may not look like much now, but if you give me a chance, I'll show you exactly why you were right to take the risk." The CEO leaned back in his chair, studying her as though she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He was not a man easily moved by emotion, and yet this encounter unsettled him. His instincts told him to dismiss her, to call security, and return to the rhythm of contracts and profits. But another part of him, the part he thought he had buried under decades of success, whispered something else. This girl wasn't begging, she was fighting, and in that fight, he saw a reflection of his own past. The girl's hands shook slightly as she placed them flat on the desk, steadying herself. "I don't want your sympathy," she said firmly. "I want your respect. Give me the hardest tasks, the dirtiest work, the things no one else wants to do. I'll take them all, just don't send me away without trying. If I fail, you'll never have to see me again, but if I succeed, then you'll know I was worth believing in." His raws. The air between them grew charged, the weight of her words pressing against the walls. The CEO narrowed his eyes, torn between disbelief and intrigue. He had spent years surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, who dressed their ambition in charm and flattery. But this girl, standing in front of him with nothing but desperation and courage, dared to tell him the truth. She wasn't here to please him. She was here to prove herself. Outside, the city pulsed with life traffic streaming, people hurrying, deals being made. But inside that room, time slowed. The CEO's gaze drifted once more to the resume, its wrinkled edges standing in stark contrast to the flawless order of his desk. He thought of the countless resumes that had crossed his table, glossy with achievements, stamped with privilege. None of them had stayed with him. None of them had shaken him the way this one did. And then, almost against his will, he asked, "What's your niche? What can you do better than anyone else?" Her answer came without hesitation. "I don't have a niche yet, but I will, because I learn faster than anyone you've ever met. Give me 1 week in any department, and I'll master what others take months to figure out. My niche is not being afraid to start from nothing and become something. That's what sets me apart." The CEO studied her, the corners of his mouth twitching almost imperceptibly. Was it amusement? Admiration? He wasn't sure himself. All he knew was that the fire in her eyes was undeniable, and it was the same fire he had once carried in his own. He tapped the resume again, slowly, deliberately. The sound echoed in the room like a drumbeat. 1 week, he repeated, his voice low. "You think you can prove yourself in 1 week?" "Yes," she said without flinching. "And if you fail?" She lifted her chin, unwavering. "Then I'll leave, and you'll never hear from me again." The CEO leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his gaze piercing into hers. "You're either the most foolish girl I've ever met, or the most dangerous, and I can't decide which one." Her lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Maybe I'm both." For the first time in years, the CEO laughed a short, sharp laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. It startled even him. He shook his head, almost in disbelief at what he was about to say. "Fine," he said finally, his tone carrying the weight of a verdict. 1 week. You'll shadow my assistant. If you fail, you're out. If you succeed." He paused, narrowing his eyes. "Then we'll talk." The girl's breath caught in her throat. Relief, disbelief, and determination all collided within her chest. She bowed her head slightly, not as submission, but as gratitude. "Thank you, sir. You won't regret this." As she turned to leave, the CEO's eyes lingered on her. He couldn't explain it, but something told him this was not just another desperate soul crossing his path. This was the beginning of something that might change both of their lives forever. The door closed softly behind her, leaving the CEO alone with the crumpled resume still on his desk. He stared at it for a long time, wondering why this girl, out of all the people who had ever demanded his attention, had left such an imprint on him. The city continued to hum outside, but inside, a new story was quietly unfolding. The elevator doors slid shut, and the girl leaned against the cool metal wall, her chest rising and falling as if she had just fought a war. Her hands, still trembling, gripped the railing tightly. She had done it. Against every odd, against the fear that had nearly swallowed her whole, she had secured a chance a single week to prove herself. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was hope. And for someone who had been living in the shadows of despair, hope was everything. As the elevator descended, she thought of her mother. She pictured her frail body lying on that worn-out mattress, struggling for breath. She imagined the hospital bills stacked high on the kitchen table, the unopened envelopes that felt heavier than bricks. For years, she had prayed for a break, for something to change. Now, she finally had it. She whispered softly to herself, "1 week. I can do this. I have to do this." Meanwhile, in the CEO's office, silence lingered even after she left. He remained seated, staring at the resume lying like a forgotten relic on his desk. The ink was slightly smudged, the paper torn at one corner. It was, by all definitions, unimpressive. And yet, it was the most memorable resume he had ever read. Why had he said yes? The question gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on discipline, on never making decisions based on emotion. He had turned down candidates with world-class credentials for not meeting his standards. But this girl, with nothing but desperation and determination, had pierced his armor. He rubbed his temples, frustrated with himself. 1 week. He muttered. What am I even thinking? But deep down, he knew. He saw something in her, a fire he once had but had long since buried. And perhaps, against his will, he wanted to see if that fire could still burn in his world of cold steel and glass. The next morning, the girl arrived at the skyscraper before dawn. The city was still waking, its streets bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Clutching a small notebook and a pen, she walked through the revolving doors, her reflection flickering across the glass. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet anticipation. Employees hurried past in sleek suits, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. They barely noticed her, just another figure blending into the stream of ambition. But she wasn't here to blend in. She was here to fight. She checked in with security, her name now temporarily on the list. The guard gave her a skeptical glance, as though wondering how someone like her had found her way into this building. She simply smiled, though inside her nerves twisted like knots. When she reached the 38th floor, she was greeted by a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, the CEO's assistant. Dressed impeccably, the woman looked her up and down, her expression betraying doubt. "So, you're the one he hired," the assistant said flatly. The girl nodded. "Yes, just for a week. I'll be shadowing you." The assistant crossed her arms, unimpressed. "Let's get one thing straight. I don't babysit. If you're here to learn, then learn fast. This office doesn't slow down for anyone, especially not charity cases." The words stung, but the girl held her ground. "I'm not here for charity. I'm here to work." The assistant arched an eyebrow, as if silently daring her to prove it. "We'll see." The day began with a whirlwind of tasks. Phones rang incessantly, emails flooded the inbox, and meetings lined up back to back. The assistant moved with mechanical precision, handling crises before they erupted, coordinating schedules with the ease of a general commanding troops. The girl followed, notebook in hand, scribbling furiously, her eyes wide as she tried to keep up. At first, it was overwhelming, the sheer speed, the constant pressure, the weight of decisions being made every second. She stumbled, made mistakes, apologized quickly, and kept moving. But as the hours passed, something shifted. Her mind began to adjust, her focus sharpened. She anticipated needs before they were spoken, fetched files before being asked, and learned shortcuts that others took weeks to master. By noon, the assistant's skeptical glances began to soften, ever so slightly. Meanwhile, the CEO observed from a distance. He watched as the girl darted from one task to another, her determination written in every movement. She wasn't perfect, far from it. But she was relentless. And in her relentlessness, he saw something that reminded him of his own climb to the top. At lunch, while others retreated to the cafeteria, she sat quietly at her desk, eating a sandwich she had packed from home, still jotting down notes. Her hair fell loosely over her face, strands sticking to her forehead from the rush of the morning. Yet her eyes gleamed with the same fire he had seen the day before. He found himself wondering, could she actually pull this off? The afternoon brought its own storm. A critical client called with a complaint, furious about a missed deadline. The assistant was caught between coordinating the CEO's packed schedule and calming the client down. In that moment of chaos, the girl stepped in. She listened carefully to the client's frustration, her voice calm, steady, empathetic. "I understand how important this is for you," she said softly. "Let me assure you, we're taking this seriously. I'll personally make sure this gets addressed immediately." Actually, and/or why. Her sincerity disarmed the client, who, though still frustrated, agreed to give the company more time. The assistant, surprised, stared at the girl as if seeing her for the first time. "You handled that?" "Well," she admitted reluctantly. The girl smiled faintly. "People don't just want solutions. Sometimes they just want to know someone is listening." The assistant didn't respond, but for the first time, respect flickered in her eyes. By the end of the day, the girl was exhausted. Her feet ached, her hands were sore from scribbling notes, and her mind felt like it had run a marathon. But beneath the exhaustion, there was pride. She had survived her first day. More than survived, she had made an impression. As she rode the elevator down that evening, she whispered again to herself, "One day down, 6 to go." And in the CEO's office, the man sat alone once more, staring out at the city lights. He thought about the girl, about her stubbornness, her courage, her refusal to back down. Against his better judgment, he felt a strange flicker of anticipation for what the rest of the week would bring. For the first time in years, he was curious. Morning arrived like a challenge. The city shook off its night sky and burst into motion, and with it, the 38th floor awakened to the rhythm of deadlines. The girl stepped out of the elevator with the first wave of employees, the strap of her worn bag digging into her shoulder, her notebook tucked close like a lifeline. She had slept only a few hours, not because she couldn't, but because her mind refused to stop rehearsing everything she had learned the day before. Who to call first, which files lived in which shared drive, the shortcuts on the scheduling software, the order in which the CEO liked his meetings, the difference between urgent and important in this particular office. The assistant glanced up as the girl approached. There was no smile of welcome, but there was no dismissal either. That was progress. The girl took her place at the small desk nearby, booted up her computer, and drew a line across her notebook page. At the top she wrote, "Day 2, keep the promise." Tasks came immediately. Vendors needed approval codes. The design team required the final brief for a pitch at noon. A European client had emailed overnight requesting a contract amendment, and legal was already grumbling about language that would complicate future deals. A public relations draft needed a quick top-line summary for the CEO's morning briefing. The phone rang. The inbox chimed. The printer jammed. The little crises that made up a corporate day marched through the door, one after another, demanding attention. She moved in that steady, unglamorous way she had learned since childhood, one action at a time. Eyes open, breath even. When the assistant stepped out for a moment, the girl fielded 3 calls, logged 2 messages, and forwarded a calendar invite to the wrong Jonathan, before catching her mistake and correcting it within a minute. She didn't hide the error. She owned it and fixed it. No stories, no excuses. From his office, the CEO watched her the way one watches a new runner on a rough course, not for style, but for stamina. She still stumbled. She still reached for the wrong folder on pure reflex. She still asked a question he considered obvious in this world. But she never, not once, retreated into flustered apology for long. He recognized the pattern almost with nostalgia. When you come from scarcity, you learn quickly that embarrassment is a luxury. You either solve the problem or it swallows you. At 9:20, the assistant returned with 2 coffees, set one on the girl's desk without comment, and slid a thick folder across the surface. "This is the Dixon portfolio," she said. "He wants the executive summary condensed to 1 page before the 10 a.m. call. No fluff, hard numbers, risks and mitigations. I'll take your first draft in 20 minutes. 20 minutes for a wall of financials." The girl felt her stomach tighten, but she nodded. She opened the folder, flipped past the glossy cover pages, and found the meat: quarterly returns, burn rate, projections, notes in the margins from someone with sharp, impatient handwriting. She scanned for the structure before the details, the arc that turned scattered lines into a story. What was the thesis? What were the essential numbers? What would cause a deal to fail? She pulled out her notebook, drew a quick outline. Thesis performance snapshot, risk index mitigation, strategy recommendation. Then she wrote like she was racing a storm. By 9:42, the draft hit the assistant's desk. By 9:47, the assistant returned it with 3 red circles and a raised eyebrow. "Don't bury the risk. He wants it up front. And this mitigation too general. If you propose a mitigation, it better be something we can actually do by Thursday." "Got it," the girl said. She adjusted, tightened, brought the risk forward, and replaced a vague, tighten oversight with a concrete fix, consolidate reporting to a single dashboard, and assign a rotating audit owner every Friday by 4 p.m., with escalation directly to the assistant if any metric drifted by more than 5%. She rewrote the opening paragraph to feel like a lever, not a cushion. By 9:55, the second draft was on the CEO's desk. At 9:58, he walked by her without slowing, the summary in his hand. He said nothing, but she saw him fold it once and slip it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the slot reserved for things he intended to use. The 10 a.m. call began in the conference room. Through the glass, she could see him at the head of the table, flipping open the page she had written. The executives leaned forward. The projection flickered to life on the far wall. The CEO spoke, and in the rhythm of his sentences she heard her own structure, reshaped by his voice, punctuated by his experience. No credit, of course. That wasn't how it worked. But as the conversation tightened around risk and mitigation, as the table moved straight to the problem that could sink the deal, she allowed herself one quiet breath of pride. She had not wasted his time. By noon, there was no time to celebrate. A supply chain delay in Shenzhen threatened to blow up a product launch. Legal wanted to postpone the quarterly review. The chief marketing officer wanted to pull out of a sponsorship the CEO had personally approved. And, layered over everything, the CEO's personal schedule shifted by the minute as calls ran long and visitors arrived early. The assistant handled the flow like a maestro, and the girl learned the music. "We never say no to a meeting outright," the assistant warned under her breath. "We say, 'The schedule is tight, can you share the top 3 outcomes you need?' Then we decide if it's email, a call, or a face-to-face. In this building, time is the currency." The girl nodded. She began to anticipate where the bottlenecks would burst. She drafted emails for review that sounded like forward motion instead of delay. She requested preliminary documents before the requests arrived, so when the CEO asked, the file was already open on the shared drive. She didn't try to act bigger than her role. She tried to make everyone else's role easier. And yet, pressure found its way in. Mid-afternoon, a director from operations stopped by the desk and frowned at her badge. "You're new," he said. "Intern? Temporary support?" She replied, even. He skimmed her, and the judgment was easy to read. "We prefer people who already know our systems." "I learn fast," she said. "Is there something you need?" He hesitated, then slid a thumb drive across the desk. "This is a mess of vendor data. We need it cleaned, deduped, matched to current contracts, and flagged for missing W-9 seconds, and we need a dashboard by tomorrow morning." The assistant looked up, readiness already in her eyes. But the girl spoke first. "I can start now. What format do you want the dashboard in?" "It is last way that the sign. In the true net that way that whatever the CEO will actually look at," the director said dryly. "He won't open anything that requires more than one click." "Understood," she said. When the director left, the assistant studied the girl for a second, as if deciding whether to step in. "That's not a small task," she warned. "I know," the girl said, plugging in the drive. "But if we can lighten the morning load, he'll have space for the 8:30 with investors. And if the W-9 flags are clear, legal stops chasing ghosts." The assistant's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was not the old skepticism either. "If you get stuck, ask." The girl got to work. She created a clean copy of the data so she wouldn't corrupt the original, then built a simple pipeline. Normalize fields, strip whitespace, standardize vendor names, match on tax IDs where available, and set rules to eliminate duplicates. For missing W-9 seconds, she flagged by vendor ID and contract status, then sorted by spend to prioritize which to chase first. For the dashboard, she kept it painfully simple. A single page with 4 tiles. Total active vendors. Contracts missing W-9. Duplicate records resolved, and top 10 vendors by spend pending compliance. Clicks, 1. Scrolls, none. She didn't have access to fancy tools. She didn't know the in-house analytics templates by heart, but she knew how to make sense from noise. She wrote clear labels and added a small note at the top. Next actions. 1. Send W-9 requests to flagged vendors. 2. Assign owner for daily compliance follow-up. 3. Escalate any contract over X amount missing W-9 by end of day. The sun had started to slide west by the time she looked up. She had missed lunch without noticing. She took a sip of water and stood to stretch just as the CEO stepped out of a meeting. He paused when he saw the dashboard on her screen. He didn't comment, he rarely did, but he walked closer, hands in his pockets, and read the headings. "Not bad," he said quietly. "Send it to operations and legal. Copy me. As Walking Wong." "Yes, sir," she replied. Her voice didn't tremble this time. In the window's reflection, the CEO caught a glimpse of her tired, focused, a little pale from skipping a meal, but unflinching. That stubborn, almost reckless devotion to improvement. He didn't know whether to admire it or warn her to pace herself. In his world, sprints turned into marathons without warning, and more than one promising newcomer had burned out quickly when they confused one great day for a sustainable life. At 6:10, when most of the floor began to thin out, the assistant put a hand over the girl's notebook. "Go home," she said. "You've done enough for today." The girl shook her head. "There's a late brief for tomorrow's investor deck. If I pull the numbers now, you'll have half the slides done by morning." "You can do it early," the assistant said. "My mother's medication pickup is early," the girl replied softly. The assistant studied her, and for a slim second the steel fell away. "How is she?" "Some days are good," the girl said, steady. Today wasn't one of them. Silence hovered, not awkward, just human. Then the assistant nodded once and removed her hand from the notebook. "All right, you get 30 minutes, and you eat something while you work." She slid the untouched half of her sandwich across the desk, already turning away so the gesture wouldn't land as pity. The girl swallowed the knot in her throat. "Thank you," she said. She stayed 35 minutes, not a second more. She pulled fresh numbers, formatted them clean, and left comments in the deck so the assistant could pick up exactly where she stopped. Then she gathered her things, powered down, and took the elevator to the lobby. The building had a different sound after hours, the echo of shoes instead of the thrum of meetings, the whisper of cleaning crews instead of the click of keyboards. She stepped into the evening air and breathed, finally, deeply. On the train home, she pressed her forehead to the window and watched lights race by. She felt heavy and light at the same time, tired in her bones, but awake in her spirit. This was what it felt like to earn ground, inch by inch. She thought of the CEO's glance at her screen, the quiet, "not bad," the way he had tucked her summary into his jacket. They weren't praise, they were permissions. In a place like this, permissions could become opportunities. When she reached the apartment, the air smelled faintly of broth. Her mother lay on the bed near the window, the cheap fan pushing warm air in circles. "You're late," her mother said, smiling with the side of her mouth that moved easily. "I brought soup," the girl said, setting the container on the small table and kneeling to help her sit up. She moved with care, practiced and patient. "How was today?" Her mother shrugged. "My body complains, your courage does not. That is a good trade." They ate together, slowly. The girl told a gentler version of her day about the summary that made it into the meeting, about the dashboard that might save time for people who rarely had any to spare, about the assistant who had started with suspicion and ended the day with half a sandwich gone from her own plate. She did not mention the director's tone or the way a security guard still asked to see her temporary pass twice. She did not talk about fear. When her mother slept, the girl stood by the window and looked out at the night. Somewhere high above, on a floor most people never saw, her life was shifting. Sentence by sentence, slide by slide, minute by minute. This is how change arrives, she thought, not as a miracle, but as a decision repeated until it becomes a path. Morning came again. Day 3 carried a different kind of test. The CEO had an investor breakfast at 8:30 with a notoriously blunt fund manager who liked to poke holes for sport. The assistant briefed the girl quickly while walking no time for sitting. He'll ask for a 5-year vision and then try to catch him on year 2. He'll pretend it's casual. It's not. Have the pipeline metrics ready and the churn report he always asks for churn. They moved like a 2-person relay. The girl queued up the metrics, cleaned a chart title that buried the key change, and attached footnotes to the churn graph, clarifying an anomaly that would otherwise become the entire conversation. She added one more line at the top of the prep sheet, in bold. If he asks for year 2 specifics, redirect to the system change that unlocks years 2 through 5. Not spin strategy. Build the bridge, then walk them over. At 8:26, the CEO paused beside their desks on the way to the elevator. He took the briefing sheet, scanned the bolded line, and said in that flat way of his, "Good. Keep the call line open." The meeting began. The girl sat ready with the files, heartbeat even, eyes sharp. When the fund manager did exactly what the assistant predicted, double-tapped year 2, the CEO didn't bite. He pivoted calmly to the system change, the one that would reduce churn by design instead of by emergency. He asked the girl for the supporting chart. She pushed it instantly. The screen updated in the conference room. The fund manager leaned back, and while he didn't smile, he also didn't pursue the trap further. Tiny victories. Monumental to the few who knew how easily a conversation could slide. After the breakfast, the CEO returned not to his office, but to the girl's desk. "Who wrote the redirect?" he asked. She sat up a fraction straighter. "I did," she said. He nodded once. "Keep doing that." He turned, then paused. "But pace yourself." She didn't fully understand what he meant until that afternoon, when fatigue arrived like a wave that ignored the shore. Her hands trembled a little. A headache pressed behind her eyes. She had been sleeping in fragments, eating out of sequence, running on adrenaline and will. That was a dangerous cocktail. She excused herself for 5 minutes, splashed water on her face in the restroom, and stared at her reflection. This was not a sprint. This was day 3 of a week that would determine whether the door stayed open or slammed shut. Back at her desk, she made a small list not of tasks but of anchors. Drink water. Eat at noon, no matter what. 5 deep breaths before difficult calls. 1 stretch every 2 hours. Remember what matters. Help the work move. She taped the list inside her notebook. Invisible to others, but visible to her. Then she went back to the rhythm. Late afternoon brought a surprise. The assistant approached, carrying a thin folder, no heavier than paper but heavy with implication. "He wants you to sit in on the 4:30 with product," she said. "Take notes. Don't speak unless he asks you to. If he does ask, be specific. No generalities. If you don't know, say you don't know and propose how you'll find out." The girl swallowed once. Understood. The product room was a different language. Roadmaps pinned to walls, sticky notes turning ideas into timelines, engineers speaking in terms that moved from abstract to concrete with dizzying speed. The CTO walked through upcoming sprints, testing schedules, API dependencies. The CEO listened, not for cleverness, but for clarity. At a certain point, the conversation drifted into fog, the kind of fog that happens when smart people disagree about the shape of a problem. The CEO looked at the girl. "Your new eyes. What's the summary?" She didn't reach for poetry. She reached for a handle everyone could hold. "We agree on the feature's value," she said, voice steady. "We disagree about the cost to implement inside the current architecture. If we freeze scope today and move the risky dependency to a separate track, we hit the marketing window. If we keep arguing the perfect design, we miss it. So the decision is not feature or no feature. It's risk on architecture versus risk on market timing. Which risk do we prefer? He's into love. He has, and crapped and hasn't." The room went quiet. It wasn't brilliance, it was framing. But framing, at the right moment, reorganizes a room. The CTO exhaled. The CEO nodded. "Thank you," he said. "We'll take market timing and accept a scoped architecture risk. Freeze the spec. 2-week track for the dependency. If it slips, we launch without it and patch in V2. Afterward, no one patted her on the back." The meeting moved on. But as they filed out, the assistant brushed her sleeve lightly, a small acknowledgement with the gentleness of someone who knew how much courage it takes to speak once, exactly right. Evening rolled over the city again. The girl prepared to leave early enough to pick up the medication and get home before the pharmacy closed. She printed the next day's agendas, organized the morning prep, and left a short note on the assistant's desk. Deck updated to reflect product decision. See slide 8. On the train, she watched a father read a picture book to his child, both of them weaving through the bumps as if the car were a cradle. She thought of her own father, a silence more than a person, a story she had stopped telling even to herself. Then she pushed the thought away gently, not in avoidance, but in sequence. There would be time for old grief later. For now, there was the work and the woman who needed her. That night, when her mother coughed hard enough to scare her, the girl sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand through the worst of it. "I'll buy the better medicine soon," the girl whispered, though promises felt like glass in her mouth. Just 1 week and everything could change. Her mother smiled with tired eyes. The girl lay awake longer than she wanted to, counting the days on the ceiling. Day 1, survive. Day 2, contribute. Day 3, frame a decision. She didn't know what Day 4 would require yet, but she knew this. The door had opened a little more, and now that the crack was there, she intended to push with everything she had. Far above, in the tower of glass, the CEO stood by his window long after the building had emptied out. He wasn't thinking about the fund manager or the quarter's margin. He was thinking about a sentence from a stranger, a sentence that had captured the exact decision his team had been circling all week. He didn't like surprises, but he had to admit, This one had served the work. He turned off the lights and left the office, the city spreading beneath him like a map of chances, some already taken, some still waiting for someone brave enough to walk in without an invitation and ask for a job that wasn't on offer. He remembered, briefly, the boy he had been, the one who had once stood in a cheap suit at a richer man's desk and learned to translate desperation into discipline. He had not thought about that boy in a long time. The elevator doors closed, the tower quieted. The week moved forward, relentless as a tide, and in its pull, two people on opposite sides of a desk were being changed, one learning to claim space, the other remembering how to give it. Day 4 began with rain, the kind of rain that didn't fall in sheets but in needles, sharp and persistent, soaking clothes within minutes and painting the city in silver streaks. The girl hurried through it with an umbrella that had seen better days, her shoes damp by the time she reached the skyscraper lobby. She shook off the water, smoothed her jacket, and stepped into the elevator with the same silent prayer she repeated each morning. Let me endure. Let me learn. Let me matter. On the 38th floor, the rhythm was already fast. The assistant was on the phone with Europe, her tone clipped and professional, one hand flying across the keyboard as she typed. She gestured for the girl to wait, then ended the call with a decisive, "Thank you, we'll confirm by noon." Turning to the girl, she handed over a thin packet. Investor debrief at 10. He'll want a clean snapshot of yesterday's product decision. Keep it lean: metrics, timelines, risks. You've got an hour. The girl nodded, slid into her chair, and got to work. She had learned the pattern now. Executives lived on the distilled version of chaos. They didn't want the full hurricane, just the eye, the one page that told them whether to brace or to move forward. She opened the product notes, highlighted the critical pivot, and sketched the new timeline. She summarized in bold, market timing chosen over architecture perfection. V2 dependency isolated. Expected ROI remains stable, with risk concentrated in integration window. By 9:40, her draft was ready. The assistant reviewed it, red pen in hand. After 3 days, the red marks were fewer. She underlined 2 phrases, swapped one passive sentence for an active one, and pushed it back across the desk. Good. Print 3 copies. He likes paper when he briefs. At 10 sharp, the CEO walked in. His eyes flicked briefly to the girl as she handed him the summary. He took it without a word, but once again he folded it neatly and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The signal was subtle, but she caught it. Useful. Keep going. The morning moved into high gear. A crisis in logistics threatened to delay shipments to a key retailer. A reporter from a major paper requested a comment on the company's environmental impact, hinting at an exposé. The assistant fielded calls, coordinated legal, drafted talking points, and, in the middle of it all, delegated a new task to the girl. Draft me a response outline for the reporter, she said. Don't write the quote, he'll do that. Just prepare the backbone. Key messages, risks, fallback lines. 20 minutes. The girl blinked. Media strategy was new terrain, but she had listened closely all week. She had heard how the assistant framed responses, how the CEO stripped language down to its core. She opened a fresh document and began. Key messages. Company acknowledges challenges in supply chain sustainability. Investments in renewable processes underway. Committed to transparency with stakeholders. Risks. Reporter may press for specific numbers not yet public. Accusation of greenwashing if response sounds vague. Fallback lines. We are not perfect, but we are improving. Specific data will be released in our upcoming sustainability report. At 11:05, she placed it on the assistant's desk. The assistant scanned it, then, for the first time, gave a single nod without corrections. You're learning? The girl allowed herself a quick smile. At noon, she slipped away to the break room with the sandwich she had packed. For once, she wasn't alone. A few junior analysts sat nearby, chatting about last night's game. They eyed her with curiosity. She wasn't part of their world yet, but one of them asked, "You new here?" "Temporary," she replied, keeping it short. "Good luck," he said, half kind, half dismissive, already turning back to his friends. She ate quickly, her notebook open beside her, reviewing the afternoon schedule. Investor calls. Product follow-up. Legal review. She circled the 3 p.m. meeting in red. Quarterly Risk Committee. From what she had heard, this was no ordinary meeting. It was where the CEO expected hard truths, not polished slides. Mistakes here could echo for weeks. By 2:55, she was ready with a thick stack of notes, distilled into 3 bullet points per risk. She wasn't presenting, but she was determined to anticipate every question. The risk committee was as intense as she had imagined. Around the table sat department heads, each armed with data and defenses. The CFO opened with financial exposure. The CTO followed with technical vulnerabilities. Operations highlighted vendor dependencies. The air thickened with tension, each leader careful not to show weakness. Midway through, a disagreement broke out between finance and operations over a supplier contract. Voices rose, the argument circling without resolution. The CEO, silent until now, turned his gaze toward the girl. "You've been listening." "Summarize." Her throat went dry. This was not a rehearsal. Every eye in the room turned to her. She inhaled, once, steady. Finance is concerned, the supplier's credit risk could destabilize quarterly cash flow. Operations argues switching suppliers now would delay shipments and increase costs. The core decision is whether we absorb financial risk for stability or absorb operational risk for security. It's not keep or cut. It's which risk is less damaging in the current window. The room stilled. The CFO frowned, then nodded reluctantly. The operations lead sighed, conceding the framing. The CEO's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. "Correct," he said simply. "We'll take the financial risk short-term. Operations, secure a backup vendor quietly in case this one collapses. Finance, monitor weekly and escalate at the first red flag." Meeting adjourned. As chairs scraped back, the girl's pulse hammered. She had spoken less than 50 words, but those words had shifted the meeting. That evening, the assistant stopped by her desk. "You should know," she said softly. "Most people don't get invited to the risk committee until year 3, and they certainly don't speak." "I didn't mean to overstep," the girl said quickly. "You didn't," the assistant replied. She hesitated, then added, "He listens to you." "That's rare." The girl sat in stunned silence long after the assistant walked away. By the time she returned home, the rain had stopped. The air smelled fresh, almost forgiving. Her mother was awake, waiting with a cup of weak tea. "You're tired," her mother observed. "Yes," the girl admitted, sitting down beside her. "But it's the good kind of tired." Her mother smiled faintly. "That's the kind that builds a future." They drank tea together in silence, the sound of dripping gutters filling the small apartment. The girl thought of the CEO's eyes on her during the meeting, the weight of responsibility, the razor's edge between failure and respect. Day 4 had asked her to carry more than she thought possible, and somehow she had. But she knew the week wasn't over. The hardest days were still to come. Day 5 arrived with a sky the color of steel and a wind that made the flag outside the building snap like a command. The girl reached the revolving doors earlier than usual, her breath a thin cloud in the morning chill. She had slept in increments 2 hours, then an hour, then another sliver of rest that felt like a blink stretched thin. Still, her steps were steady. She had begun to understand this world's gravitational pull. It never let up, it never apologized, and it rewarded only those who learned to move cleanly under the weight. On the 38th floor, the assistant was already at her desk, coat still on, hair still damp from the weather. "You're early," she said without looking up. "I'm invested," the girl replied. It wasn't bravado, it was a fact. "Good," the assistant said, "because today is not a training day, it's a real day." She slid a slim folder toward the girl. "Board pre-read goes out at noon. Your task, scrub the KPI section. If the numbers contradict each other anywhere, slides, footnotes, appendix, you catch it. No surprises." "He hates surprises." The girl nodded and opened the folder. Metrics spilled out in neat tables: ARR, net dollar retention, CAC payback, cohort analyses that moved like stacked waves across quarters. She built a cross-check list in her notebook: ARR versus revenue bridge, churn versus cohort loss, CAC payback versus blended channels, variance explanations, single line. Then she began the quiet craftsman work that no one celebrated but everyone depended on. Line by line, sheet by sheet. If a number existed in two places, it needed to agree. If it didn't, the story broke. At 8:10, a discrepancy surfaced. Net dollar retention on slide 11 read 118%. The appendix, same period, said 114%. 4 percentage points sounded small. In a boardroom, they were a fault line. She didn't panic. She traced the sources. Slide 11 referenced the core product only. The appendix included an experimental add-on with a higher churn. She wrote an adjustment note, then paused. The more she stared, the more it felt wrong in a different way, not deceptive, but misleading. Slide 11, in isolation, flattered the metric. The appendix, alone, deflated it. The truth was in the blended view and the footnote that would keep the CEO from getting ambushed. She walked the note to the assistant. "These two don't match because of scope," she said, pointing. "We need one sentence on slide 11. Core-only view. Blended total NDR 114%, see appendix. And move the appendix reference onto the main slide. If we bury the lower number, the board will find it and assume we were hiding." The assistant's eyes lifted. "And you prefer to hand the board the stick they like to hit people with?" "I prefer to remove the stick," the girl said evenly. "If we name it before they do, it becomes judgment, not a gotcha." The assistant's mouth curled toward approval. "Make the fix. Send me the diff." By 8:40, the slides matched the truth. Not the prettiest truth, just the one they could defend under heat. The girl exhaled slowly, heat leaving her shoulders. She saved the file, checked the versioning, and pinged the assistant a clean summary of changes with slide numbers so no one had to hunt. At 9, the CEO arrived, coat folded over his arm, phone tucked under his chin as he ended a call with a clipped, "No, we don't do last-minute commitments without a test. Send the data." He set the phone down and took the board deck without being asked. He flipped to slide 11, paused on the new line of disclosure, and turned his head slightly toward the girl. Not a smile. A near imperceptible shift from neutrality to acknowledgement. Then he moved on. The morning picked up speed. Legal flagged a clause in a distributor contract that could backfire if a regional partner failed to meet minimums. Product sent over a hotfix proposal that might temporarily degrade load times in exchange for stability. Marketing begged for air cover on an event slot that had quietly ballooned in cost. Everywhere, the same unsentimental calculus repeated: what risk was worth it now, and what risk would metastasize later. At 10:20, operations pinged the assistant. "Vendor compliance dashboard is live. Exec summary, please." The girl's pulse kicked when she realized they were referring to the panel she had built 2 days earlier. The assistant forwarded the request to her with a single line. "You wrote it. You summarize it." The girl kept it unadorned. Total vendors, 1,284. Missing W9. 37 weighted to top 10 by spend equals 7. Duplicates resolved, 63. Priority actions. Send W-9 requests to 7 high-spend vendors. Assign weekly owner. Escalate is greater than $250K contracts missing W-9 by EOD. She hit send. Operations replied with a thumbs-up emoji, a small, modern benediction. She let herself take one slow sip of water. At 11:03, a new problem arrived with a face. A vice president she hadn't met before, a man with a precise haircut and a suit that telegraphed quiet money, stopped at her desk and tapped the board deck in his hand. "Slide 17, he said. "Pipeline coverage." Where did the cutoff filter come from? "The CRM, the girl said, straightening. "Cut at 70% probability to avoid inflating coverage." The footnote explains the change from last quarter's 60%. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "And who changed last quarter's convention?" "I did," she said. "With the assistant's approval." He said. "Brave." His tone made the word a warning. "The board likes to see momentum. You've removed some." "I've removed noise," she replied carefully. "At 60%, we included wishful thinking. At 70%, we include work. Understood at 1. So, actually 1. The VP held her gaze a second longer than necessary, then shifted it to the assistant's desk and softened his tone. "We should consider reverting just for this meeting. Optics matter." The assistant stood. "Optics matter the most when they collapse under questions," she said. "Level. We're not reverting. If you want more coverage, do more work." The VP's jaw barely tightened. He left. The girl stared at her screen until the screen stopped trembling. She had learned, again, that in this place, truth had to be sturdy enough to survive people who preferred fog. She added a second footnote to slide 17, linking the new convention to win rate guidance approved by sales. Not defensive, just armed. At 11:40, the world tilted. Her phone buzzed with the name she never ignored. The neighbor who checked in on her mother when she couldn't be home. "She's fallen," the text read. "Bathroom." "I think she fainted. I called the clinic. They can take her at 12:30. Can you come?" For a moment, the boardroom, the glass, the skyline, all of it fell away. Only the narrow bathroom in their apartment, the too thin rug, the sharp corner of the sink, and the frail woman she loved remained. The girl's fingers froze on the keys. She swallowed once, hard. Then she stood and walked to the assistant. "My mother fainted," she said softly. "The clinic can see her at 12:30. I can get her there if I leave now and come back by 2. The assistant's eyes changed at once, less steel, more human. She flicked a look toward the CEO's closed door, toward the clock, toward the board pre-read that needed to go out in 20 minutes. "Take your bag," she said. "Go, I'll cover. Text me if plans change." The girl blinked. "I can go," the assistant repeated, already moving to take her seat. "Your work is good. Your mother is more important. Move." The elevator punched down the floors like a falling heartbeat. The girl ran the 3 blocks to her building, the city crowd parting just enough to let urgency through. In the apartment, the neighbor was kneeling by the bathroom door, a steady presence in a flowered blouse. Her mother sat propped against the tub, pale and embarrassed. "I'm fine," her mother whispered. "Just stood too fast." The girl checked for a bump, for blood, for anything worse than fright. "We're going to the clinic," she said, already lifting, already arranging, already turning fear into motion. She hailed a cab and held her mother's hand the entire ride, counting breaths, counting streetlights. At the clinic, the waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and patience. A nurse took vitals with gentle efficiency. A doctor with kind eyes asked questions. The girl answered quickly, clearly, without drama. The medications, the diet, the last dizzy spell. He nodded and said words that braided relief with vigilance. Dehydration, low blood pressure, adjust dosage. Rest. They would run a few tests, and if they were clean, they could go home with instructions and a promise to follow up. The girl texted the assistant. At clinic. Likely dehydration. Back by 2. The reply came faster than a heartbeat. Board pre-read out. Deck locked. Take the time you need. Doors don't close because you breathe. The girl smiled at the phone, a small, tired smile that belonged to the kind of day that would end while you were still in it. She bought a bottle of water and coaxed her mother to sip. She asked the nurse for one more blanket even though the room wasn't cold. She waited, in the way one waits when the person in the bed is part of your own body. The tests came back clean. They rode home in quiet. The girl settled her mother in bed with tea, water, and the television remote. "I'll be back by 7, she said. "Call me, or call the neighbor if anything changes." Her mother squeezed her hand. "I do not worry when you go," she said. "I worry when you forget to eat." "I'll eat," the girl promised. She ran back to the tower. It was 1:58 when she slid into her chair. The assistant looked up with a single question in her eyes. The girl nodded. "Minor. She'll be okay." "Good," the assistant said, and the way she said it landed like gratitude. "You're on the 2:15 pre-brief with product. He wants crisp, no wandering. I'm ready." The girl said, and she was. Because sometimes clarity arrived after the kind of morning that rearranged your priorities in a way that no executive could teach you. The pre-brief moved quickly. Product summarized the hotfix decision. Engineering traded guarantees for conditions, and the CEO did the math out loud on risk versus uptime, an abacus made of seconds, users, and trust. The girl listened for friction and named it only when asked, never chasing credit, always serving clarity. When the meeting ended, he looked at her for half a breath longer than strictly necessary. It was almost nothing. It was everything. At 3:10, the VP from the morning reappeared, the board deck open on a tablet, his tone oiled but cool. "We've decided to restore the 60% threshold for pipeline coverage," he said. "Board will appreciate the continuity." "We won't," the assistant said without looking up. The CEO already saw the 70% line. "It stays." The VP redirected his smile at the girl. "Sometimes it pays to be flexible. Sometimes it costs," she said before she could stop herself. She didn't raise her voice. She just refused to bow it. He blinked. "Careful," he said softly. The CEO stepped out of his office at that exact moment, one of those accidents that feel like timing when you need them. "Careful with what?" he asked, voice mild. He took the tablet, scanned the slide, and returned it without inflection. "Keep the 70. If the board wants coverage, they can fund it." He walked on. The VP's smile tightened until it disappeared. He left without another word. The girl exhaled through her nose and returned to work, filing the encounter under lesson. Some storms are weathered by truth, others by the fact that someone higher up saw you standing in it. At 4, the day delivered one more trial. A journalist emailed a list of pointed questions ahead of the exposé hint from the morning. What percentage of your supply chain is audited by third parties? When was the last time you terminated a supplier for non-compliance? How many of your overseas facilities meet the new environmental standard? The assistant read the questions, then looked at the girl. "Outline," she said. "Same as before, but assume a hostile read. If there's a hole, patch it with process, not spin." The girl drafted quickly, measuring every sentence against a 3-part test she'd built in her head. Is it true? Is it complete enough to withstand scrutiny? Does it commit us to something we should do anyway? She suggested a public pledge narrow enough to hit, meaningful enough to matter. Third-party audits on top 80% by spend within 12 months. Publish audit rate quarterly. Terminate any supplier failing to remediate within 90 days. The assistant read it twice and hummed, an absent-minded sound she made when a piece fit the puzzle. "He'll like this," she said, because he can defend it and execute it. At 4:30, product pinged an edge case and the hotfix would degrade load times on low-bandwidth connections, a small portion of users with a big mouth if angry enough. The CEO asked for a go divided by no-go in 10 minutes. The room poised on the seesaw. The girl cut the decision to its frame, a sentence she didn't say out loud but carried like a compass. We will accept controlled pain now, to avoid uncontrolled pain later. When the CEO chose to ship, he did it with the fallback planned, the metric watched, and the apology drafted in case they needed it. By 6, the floor thinned. The board pre-read had landed. The journalist's outline was with legal. The hotfix held. Her mother texted a heart emoji, not because she loved hearts, but because it was the easiest button to press. The girl rubbed her eyes and stood to leave. The assistant stopped her with a small stack of papers, printed emails, something old-fashioned in a world that loved clouds. These are the notes he wrote to himself when he started, the assistant said quietly. Not for the file, for his pocket. I found them when we moved floors. I keep them to remind myself what this place is supposed to be. The girl took the papers like they were fragile. The handwriting was slanted and urgent. Never confuse speed with movement. Protect the truth. The numbers are the oxygen. Hire for hunger, not polish. Polish can be taught. Be kind at full volume. There is no quiet kindness here. If you forget what this felt like, you become the problem you built this to solve. The girl read them twice, then a third time. The assistant watched her with a tight, almost private smile. He's not sentimental, she said, but he used to be personal. Don't let him forget. The girl tucked the papers back into the stack and returned them. Why are you showing me this? Because you won't weaponize it, the assistant said simply. And because you're doing the job you asked for, even if no one has changed your title yet. They stood there a moment in the soft quiet between waves. Then the assistant tilted her head toward the elevator. Go. Your mother will be waiting. And eat before you get there. The girl gathered her bag and walked to the elevator. The doors slid open with a whisper. As they closed, she caught sight of the CEO at his window, not looking out but down, at a single sheet of paper held in both hands. She wondered if it was slide 11, the honest line, or a note from the morning, or nothing important at all, and everything at once. On the train, she unwrapped a small pastry from the corner bakery and ate it in slow, grateful bites. She thought of thresholds, 60% to 70%, wish to work, fear to forward motion. She thought of her mother's hand in hers in the taxi, and the way relief makes you generous. She thought of the VP's smile and how some smiles mean welcome and some mean war. She thought of the assistant's sandwich on day 2 and the stack of notes on day 5, a breadcrumb trail through a forest that would eat you if you stopped paying attention. At home, her mother was awake with a show humming low on the television. The girl made soup, refilled the water, arranged the pills in a clean row, and sat on the edge of the bed while her mother ate. They didn't talk about the fall. They didn't talk about the board. They talked about a silly commercial with a dancing dog and a neighbor who sang off-key while watering plants. They held on to ordinary things because ordinary things were the safest bridge between hard hours. When the dishes were washed and the lights were low, the girl stood by the window and looked out at the city. Its lights like a million small promises. She wrote day 5 at the top of a fresh page in her notebook and listed what the day had asked of her and what it had given back. Asked, choose truth over optics. Asked, leave and return without breaking the work. Asked, speak once, precisely, and then shut up. Gave, trust borrowed from someone who remembers. Gave, a line of honesty that will hold in a room built to bend. Gave, one more day inside the door. She closed the notebook and closed her eyes and counted 5 slow breaths. Tomorrow would not be kinder, but she would be stronger. Not loud strong, not headline strong. Quiet strong, the kind that makes other people's work easier, the kind that threads a single sentence through a room and ties it to the floor so the wind can't take it. In the tower, the CEO left his window and turned off the last light. He thought of the numbers that kept the machine breathing, of the questions that would come from people who knew how to ask them, of the girl who had chosen to make a slide more honest instead of more impressive. He did not smile. He did not sigh. He just noted, internally, the simplest of conclusions. The week's experiment had already returned value. The rest would be about slope, not spark. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with their practiced hush. The building held its breath like it always did before a board meeting. And, somewhere between the 30th floor and the lobby, the man who had taught himself to forget the beginning admitted that he had begun to remember. Day 6 did not feel like a day at all. It felt like a battlefield already in motion by the time the sun rose. The board meeting was less than 24 hours away, and the entire building buzzed with the nervous energy of soldiers preparing for inspection. The girl stepped out of the elevator into a storm of clipped voices, hurried footsteps, and the constant ping of inboxes under siege. She tightened her grip on her notebook. 6 days ago, she had stood in this same place with nothing but desperation and a crumpled resume. Now she carried a different kind of weight, the expectation that she could hold her own in a world where weakness was not forgiven. The assistant handed her a stack of files the moment she sat down. Last checks, pipeline, churn, burn rate, expansion, ARR. He'll want reconciliations before lunch. The girl flipped open the first folder and began scanning. Numbers ran together like streams, but she had trained herself to hear when the current bent in the wrong direction. By 9:10, she found a mismatch. The churn report listed 3.7% for Q2, but the financial bridge said 3.4%. It was small, but small cracks broke walls. She traced the source, one report rounded early, the other late. She fixed the error, added a footnote, and pushed the corrected file into the master deck. At 9:35, she found another. ARR expansion double-counted 2 clients in the Europe tab. She marked them, corrected the totals, and recalculated the growth rate. When she finished, the number was lower, but true. She walked the update to the assistant. "It looks worse," she said. "But it's real." The assistant glanced at the numbers, then at her. Better to lose 1 point now than 5 points when the board notices. Good catch. The girl sat down again, heart steady. She had learned. Survival in this place was not about avoiding mistakes. It was about catching them before anyone else did. At 10, the CEO summoned them both into his office. The glass walls reflected the storm of the floor outside, but inside, the air was sharp and still. He didn't waste time. "What breaks tomorrow?" he asked. The assistant started, outlining potential flashpoints: the vendor compliance dashboard, the adjusted churn numbers, the hotfix performance dip. The CEO listened, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When she finished, he turned to the girl. "And you?" She swallowed once, then spoke. Slide 17. Pipeline coverage. It's honest at 70%, but some board members will say it looks thin compared to last quarter. They'll ask why it dropped. If we lead with the higher win rate from better filtering, it becomes a story of discipline, not weakness. But if we let them frame it, it becomes fragility. The CEO's eyes narrowed, sharp as glass. "And your recommendation? Name the drop before they do. Tie it to discipline. Then pivot to win rate. If we act like we're hiding it, they'll turn it into a weapon. If we own it, it becomes armor." He leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Good. That's the frame I'll use." The assistant's gaze flicked briefly toward the girl, an almost invisible nod of approval. The rest of the morning was a blur of preparation. Every slide was checked, every metric cross-verified, every narrative rehearsed until it could withstand interruption. The girl learned that a board meeting was not about persuasion, but about survival, the art of emerging with more trust than you began with. At noon, the assistant ordered sandwiches. She pushed one across the desk to the girl. "Eat," she said firmly. "No good to anyone if you faint in the middle of the day." The girl obeyed, chewing mechanically, her mind already racing through possible questions the board might throw. What about international expansion? What about regulatory exposure? What about sustainability commitments? She scribbled notes, drafting crisp, one-line answers that could be pulled like tools from a belt. At 2, a crisis hit. A leak. A journalist tweeted a blurry screenshot of slide 11, the very slide the girl had fixed, the one that now showed the blended NDR at 114%. The caption read, "Company quietly lowers retention expectations ahead of board meeting." Trouble ahead? The floor erupted. PR called. Legal called. Phones rang with demands for statements. Panic rippled like electricity. The CEO emerged from his office, phone in hand. "Who has eyes on this?" The assistant stepped forward. "We saw it," drafting response. The girl spoke before she could stop herself. "Don't deny it. Confirm it. Say it's exactly what's in the board deck. Transparency, not spin." The room froze. All eyes turned to her. The CEO studied her, expression unreadable. Then he nodded once. "She's right. We don't hide. Draft the line. As previewed in our materials, blended NDR reflects inclusion of add-on churn. Transparency builds strength. Send it." PR balked. "But that confirms the leak. Better we confirm than they discover." The CEO cut in. "Send it." Within minutes, the statement went out. The tweet slowed. Other voices chimed in. Unusual honesty from a major firm. Interesting. The storm began to ease. The assistant leaned toward the girl, whispering, "That could have gone either way." The girl whispered back, "But it went this way." By late afternoon, exhaustion pressed on her shoulders like stone. Still, she pushed forward. At 4:30, she prepped call notes for the CEO's one-on-one with the CFO. At 5:15, she corrected a mislabeled chart axis that could have humiliated them in front of the board. At 6, she helped the assistant consolidate tomorrow's speaking order into a single sheet the CEO could slip into his pocket. When the day finally ended, she lingered at her desk, staring at the skyline, glowing gold and silver in the setting Sunday. Her notebook lay open to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, Day 6. Stand in the storm. She listed what she had learned. Truth is faster than spin. Numbers are weapons if you let someone else name them first. Even fear can be fuel, if you keep moving. She closed the notebook, packed her bag, and left. At home, her mother was waiting, sitting up with the television, glowing softly. "You look like a soldier returning from battle," she said with a faint smile. "It felt like one," the girl admitted, setting down her bag. She knelt by the bed, smoothing the blanket. "Tomorrow is the board meeting. It's the biggest day yet." Her mother reached for her hand. "You are not carrying the world. You are carrying yourself, and that is enough." The girl bowed her head, fighting the tightness in her throat. "I don't want to fail." "You won't," her mother said simply, "because you already decided not to." Hate sit. That night, as the girl lay awake listening to the hum of the city, she repeated the words over and over. "I already decided. I already decided." And in the tower, the CEO stood alone by his window, reviewing the slides one last time. His eyes fell on slide 11. For the first time in years, he felt something unusual before a board meeting, not dread, not calculation, but the faint, sharp spark of pride. Not pride in the numbers. Pride in the courage it had taken someone new to insist on showing them. Day 7 dawned with a sky clear as glass, as if the storm of yesterday had emptied itself and left the city clean. But inside the skyscraper, tension buzzed louder than ever. Today was the board meeting. Today was the verdict. The girl arrived before sunrise, her footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. She wore the same simple clothes she had worn all week, pressed as neatly as she could manage, her notebook tucked under her arm like armor. When she stepped onto the 38th floor, the air was already charged. Assistants carried folders, executives rehearsed lines under their breath, printers spat out last-minute revisions. The building felt like a hive preparing for inspection by its queen. The assistant handed her a flash drive. Backup of the deck. Triple-check formatting on the main screen in the boardroom. If the projector cuts or the fonts break, you'll fix it before anyone blinks. The girl nodded. On it. She hurried to the boardroom, a vast chamber of glass and polished wood, the city sprawling beneath it like a map. She loaded the deck, checked every slide transition, tested fonts, confirmed colors. Then she ran it again. And again. No surprises today. Not one. By 8:30, the directors began to arrive. They came in tailored suits, carrying leather folders and sleek tablets, their expressions sharp with expectation. They were the kind of people who had shaped industries, moved markets, toppled and built companies with a vote. The girl slipped into the corner of the room, notebook in hand, invisible yet present. At 9, the CEO entered. The room hushed at once. He carried only the deck in one hand and the folded speaking sheet in the other. His face was calm, unreadable, carved in stone. He took his seat at the head of the table, looked each director in the eye, and began. The presentation moved like a march. First, financials. Revenue growth, burn rate, margins. The CFO spoke, his voice steady, but the room's questions sliced like knives. Why did retention dip? One director asked, eyes narrowing at slide 11. The girl held her breath. The CEO didn't flinch. Because we counted honestly, he said. Blended NDR reflects reality at 114%. If we had left the scope at core only, you'd see 118%. But we chose transparency, and that discipline has already improved win rate, as you'll see in the next slide. He clicked forward. Slide 12 showed exactly that win rate's up 7 points. The board murmured, grudging but impressed. Next, operations. The compliance dashboard appeared on the screen, the one she had built. Vendor compliance is at 97%, the CEO said. 37 vendors missing W9 seconds, 7 of them high spend, requests already sent. Escalation process in place. Full compliance expected within weeks. No one questioned it. The girl gripped her notebook tighter. Her work, invisible, had spoken for itself. Then, product. The CTO outlined the recent decision to prioritize market timing over architectural perfection. We launch V1 on schedule, with V2 enhancements in development, he said. A director raised an eyebrow. Aren't you risking technical debt? The CEO answered without pause. Yes. But we're choosing market risk over opportunity cost. It's deliberate, contained, and monitored. V2 will patch. Missing the window would not. The room nodded, some reluctantly, but the framing held. At 10:15, the sharpest blade came out. A director leaned forward, steepling his fingers. The press is already speculating about retention. You think honesty is enough? Investors don't reward truth, they reward performance. How do you defend that? The CEO's gaze swept the table. Then he said, evenly, performance is built on truth. If we lie to ourselves now, we will collapse later. I would rather show you the real number today and the real improvement tomorrow than a fake story both days. Silence. Heavy. Then another director chuckled, shaking his head. You haven't changed, have you? Always too stubborn to polish the silver. The CEO's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Silver shines when it's real, not when it's painted. The room broke into soft laughter. Tension eased. The meeting moved on. In the corner, the girl felt her heart pounding. His words were not just his, they were hers, too. He had spoken the frame she had named, and in that moment she realized she had not just survived this week. She had shifted the voice of the most powerful man in the room. By noon, the meeting closed. The board filed out, some satisfied, some skeptical, but none victorious over him. The CEO stood alone at the head of the table, folding the speaking sheet back into his pocket. For a moment he looked older, tired, but then his eyes found the girl in the corner. He beckoned her forward. She approached, notebook clutched tight. "You framed the questions before they did," he said. "That's why today worked." Her throat tightened. "I just did what I thought was right. That's why it worked," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "Your week is over. But if you want it, the job is yours." The words crashed over her like a wave. Relief, disbelief, joy, all tangled together. She managed to nod. "Yes, I want it." "Then earn it every day," he said. "Because one good week isn't enough. This place eats people who think it is." "I know," she whispered. He gave a single nod, then turned and walked out. The girl stood alone in the boardroom, the city blazing beneath her, her notebook trembling in her hands. She had come here with nothing but desperation. She was leaving with a chance, a path, and a voice that had been heard in the highest room of all. When she finally stepped into the elevator, she let herself smile just a little, just enough. Day 7 had not broken her. It had opened the door wider than she had ever imagined. The Monday after the board meeting felt like a new country with the same weather. The glass walls still caught the sunrise at the same angle. The coffee still smelled like ambition, not comfort. The 38th floor still pulsed with the city's restless heartbeat, but the badge on the girl's lanyard was different now. Not temporary support. Not visitor. It was her name, clean and simple, and beneath it a title that had never belonged to her before. Analyst, Office of the CEO. She touched the plastic as if it might burn her. It didn't. It just sat there, ordinary as oxygen and twice as precious. The assistant noticed her hovering at the edge of her new desk, a step closer to the CEO's door than last week, a step further from the elevators. "Don't stare at it," she said dryly, though her eyes were warm. "Badges do two things: open doors and attract tests. The doors are yours. The tests begin at 9. "I'm ready," the girl said. She wasn't, and she was. Readiness in this place was not a feeling. It was a choice repeated often enough that muscle memory could carry you when your courage faltered. "Good," the assistant replied, sliding a stack of documents into the inbox tray that now actually belonged to the girl. "Welcome to the job you already started doing." The morning didn't announce itself with a ceremony. It arrived as it always did, piecemeal, demanding, specific. A terse email from legal about a regulatory inquiry. A calendar change to take a meeting the CEO had sworn he wouldn't take until he suddenly would. A note from product, pilot cohort numbers in, need synthesis by noon, and a short message from the CEO himself without greeting or sign-off, like a stone dropped into a lake. Find the hole in this forecast before the finance team does. Slide 23. The girl opened slide 23. Revenue by region. A slope of hope and a footnote that tried to hide its shape. She looked for what didn't move the way the rest moved. There. Europe's Q3 spike stepped above trend like a ladder rung in the wrong place. The explanatory note cited seasonality. The raw data, when she pulled it, thought less highly of that excuse. It wasn't seasonality. It was a wholesale deal with a retailer who had historically returned product. The forecast claimed the booking. The refund risk lived in a separate tab where forecasts go to be forgotten. She didn't accuse. She assembled. A short summary, a clean chart, a question that named the risk without burning the team that made it. If returns track to historical average, Effective Q3 will settle to X, not Y. Should we model a reserve now to avoid walking this back in October? She sent it to the assistant and the CFO's chief of staff with the subject line, Slide 23, Proactive Reserve. The reply came from the CFO himself. Good catch. Model the reserve at 60% historical and 80% worst case. Bring it to the 11:30. The girl blinked at the name in the From field, the lack of hierarchy in the request. She could have danced in her chair and still be small enough to fit inside her gratitude. Instead, she opened a new sheet and got to work. At 9:07, the CEO stepped out, eyes flicking over the floor like a pilot scanning instruments. "You saw slide 23, he said. Not a question. "Yes," the girl replied, standing. "We're modeling the reserve now." He nodded once, then motioned to the office. "Walk." She followed him inside. The door clicked shut with that soft, decisive sound she was beginning to love and fear in equal measure. He didn't sit. He stood at the window, city flaring below, and spoke without preamble. "You did something rare last week. You made the work better without making yourself bigger than the work." He glanced at her. "Keep doing that, and you'll have a career. Stop, and you'll have a story you tell yourself about a week you were brave." He turned back to the glass. "I don't need more stories in this building. I need people who will hold the line when the room prefers fog." "I understand," she said quietly. He studied her for a beat, as if testing whether the words had landed where they needed to. "Good. Now listen. Authority here is a ladder made of paper and steel. The title is paper. The trust is steel. You earned some steel. Protect it. Don't spend it gossiping or policing. Spend it telling the truth faster than anyone else can deny it. I will. Also," he added, almost as an afterthought, "take lunch. People who never step away think exhaustion is excellence. It's not." Her surprise must have flickered across her face because the corner of his mouth moved 0.5 millimeter. "It took me 5 years to learn that," he said. "Don't take 5. He dismissed her with a tilt of his head. The meeting was over. The lesson was not. Back at her desk, the assistant was already waiting with another test. Sustainability Pledge Follow-Up. The journalist's email turned into a story, and the story turned into calls from 3 NGOs we actually respect and 20 vendors who pretend they're saints. Draft the external memo to suppliers. Specific asks, timelines, consequences. Make it readable by someone who spends their day fixing machines, not reading memos. The girl nodded and pulled a blank document. She wrote the way a bridge is designed. Simple lines, clear load-bearing expectations, no decorative weight, audit scope. Top 80% by spend, third-party only. Timeline, 12 months, quarterly progress shared. Remediation window, 90 days. Consequence, termination at 91 days, without exception. Support. A list of approved auditors at negotiated rates. A hotline for questions. An offer to review mitigation plans before the 90 days ended. No moralizing. No grandstanding. Just standards and help. She read it aloud once, listening for pretension. She found none. She sent it to the assistant and legal. Legal removed exactly 1 comma and added 1 sentence. This policy applies globally. The assistant changed nothing. "Send it," she said. Then categorize the replies: real questions, real resistance, theater. By 10, her inbox was a fresh lesson in human behavior. Real questions were short and focused. Which auditors do you accept? Do you recognize local equivalents? What format for reporting? Real resistance arrived, wrapped in flattery. We so value our partnership and led quickly to excuses about timelines and costs. Theater arrived in long paragraphs with sweeping words about commitment and excellence and absolutely no dates. She built 3 bins and a simple rule set for each. Real questions got answers within 2 hours. Real resistance got a phone call with a timeline, and the cost of non-compliance stated without raised voice. Theater got a template reply with pointed blanks. At 11:22, the CFO's chief of staff leaned over the desk. Reserve modeled? 2 versions, the girl said, handing over the summary sheet. 60% historical and 80% worst case. I recommend 60 now and a weekly monitor. Agreed, he said, then added, also, the board notes made the rounds. Nice work. Thank you, she said, because she hadn't done it for acknowledgement, and because acknowledgement, when it came, deserved to be met with a straight spine. The 11:30 was brisk. The reserve went in. The forecast stopped telling a pretty lie and started telling an honest story. The CEO asked 2 questions, short enough to fit on a post-it, then moved on. After lunch, she took one, because she had been told to, and because she had promised herself she would. The day unfolded in a new cadence. She was no longer shadowing. She was carrying. The assistant still ran the orchestra, but now the girl played an instrument that people heard when she played it wrong. It made her sharper. It made her gentle, too, in a new way. With herself, with her mother, with anyone trying to do good work in a building that demanded it. At 2:15, operations pinged with a problem that wasn't numbers and wasn't small. A supplier in a country without much sunlight on its factories had failed the initial third-party audit. Not paperwork, conditions. A whistleblower had sent photos. The auditor's report didn't bury the lead. Heat stress, inadequate ventilation, overtime past legal limits, and a line in bold that stopped the girl's breath. Evidence of restricted movement in dormitories. The euphemism felt like a bruise. Legal wanted to proceed cautiously. PR wanted proof. Operations wanted time. The CEO wanted clarity, not consensus. He called a meeting at 3 and had her sit in, without agenda, which meant she was expected to see the shape of things and name it. The room filled with positions. Operations argued for remediation plans, incremental improvements, measurable steps, monthly check-ins. Legal cautioned against publishing specifics before facts were triple verified. PR reminded everyone that silence and spin carried equal risks in a world allergic to both. The assistant watched the room like she always did, tracking not just words but what those words would cost tomorrow. The CEO listened, hands folded, face still, the storm behind his eyes the only weather in the room. When the talking looped, when it became clear they were circling courage instead of landing it, he looked at the girl. Frame it. She didn't hesitate. It's not a comms problem, she said softly. It's a dignity problem. We can't audit people into freedom. We can only contract with suppliers who already understand what a person is worth. She met Operations' eyes. If we stay, we become the reason they change or the excuse they don't. If we leave, we take money away fast enough that someone else will fill the order, maybe worse. So the decision is this. Do we believe our leverage can change the reality in 90 days? If yes, we stay with teeth money held back, standards enforced, audits published, workers interviewed privately by a third party, and the right to drop at day 91. If no, we leave now, and we say why. The room quieted. No one looked at PR. Everyone looked at the CEO. He nodded once. We stay, with teeth, he said. Operations, hold payment above cost. Legal, draft the terms with 90-day milestones and the right to publish the audit summary if they fail. PR, prepare the statement we'll release if we walk, and add a procurement search for a backup supplier who already meets the standard. I won't be extorted by a remediation plan that never ends. He stood to leave, then stopped at the door and looked back at the girl. Write the worker interview protocol, he said. Plain language, real privacy. To the room. If anyone touches a worker for talking, we're out within the hour. People moved, fast. The assistant brushed by the girl and whispered, You did good. Now do the hard part well. At 9. And at Teckenhind, The hard part was exactly what it sounded like. Designing a process that would protect the people everyone else talked about as if they were line items. She reached out to one of the NGOs that had responded to their pledge not with a press release, but with a set of free resources and an offer to help. Within 40 minutes, a program director called her back, voice low, precise, kind. "Private interviews require trust and logistics," the woman said. "You need a place off-site, appointments staggered so workers aren't marked, transport back, and a counselor on hand in case disclosure triggers past trauma. You also need to pay for time lost and guarantee no retaliation. Put that in writing and enforce it." The girl wrote as fast as she could type, capturing every detail, then reading back the draft protocol line by line until the NGO director said, "That will hold." She thanked her, meant it, and looped legal and operations with the protocol and the point that mattered most. If compliance cannot protect workers who speak, compliance is theater. By 5, the terms were drafted. By 6, the supplier had been informed. By 7, the CEO had approved the public commit with a line that would annoy his detractors precisely because it wasn't defensive. "We chose to spend our money where people can breathe." The statement didn't go out. It sat in a folder labeled, "If needed." The shape of the decision was the statement. The words were just its shadow. The girl rode home with the kind of tired that tugged eyelids down, as if the city's streetlights contained hidden gravity. At the apartment, her mother was awake, a bowl of soup cooling on the nightstand and a thin book open across her lap. "You look different," her mother said, studying her face. "I feel different." The girl admitted, slipping off her shoes and sinking into the chair by the bed. She told the story without the uglier nouns, or maybe with them but wrapped in a tone that kept them from throwing knives at the small room. She said supplier and audit and protocol, and her mother heard people and fear and chance. When the girl finished, her mother reached for her hand and squeezed. "You made a sentence that kept a person safe," she said. "That is not a small day." The girl laughed, a tired sound with warmth in it. "It's not finished. None of it's finished." "Good," her mother replied. "Then you have to wake up tomorrow." They ate together in quiet. The girl forced herself to drink water, to eat bread, to take in fuel like someone who expected to need it. Later, she sat by the window with her notebook open on her knee and wrote Week 2. Build the bones. Under it, she listed 3 things. Systems that outlast you. Standards that don't bend when the room does. Sentences that hold under heat. She slept. Not long. Enough. The week turned. The forecast reserve held. The sustainability memo cut theater down to 2-paragraph surrenders. The supplier sent their remediation plan within 48 hours, thin at first, then thicker as they realized the money would not move until the plan did. The NGO agreed to sit in on worker interviews as a witness with authority, not a prop. Legal frowned at the speed and learned to breathe through it. Operations grumbled at the extra work and did it anyway because the CEO had chosen his risk and written it down. The girl made mistakes. She mislabeled a field in a spreadsheet that almost carried a wrong number into a meeting. She apologized, corrected it, and wrote a rule in her notebook. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. She wrote email drafts too long and then learned how a sentence is stronger when it has to carry more meaning with less decoration. She watched the assistant decline 6 meetings with a single phrase, "Send outcomes in writing. If they require decisions, we'll schedule." She copied the phrase down like a spell. The VP with the precise haircut tried to box her a couple of times, small traps that looked like mentorship until they snapped like cheap bracelets. "You're good at framing," he said one afternoon at her desk. "Dangerous skill. Keep it contained." "Contained by what?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Hierarchy," he said, smiling the way people smile when they ask you to lower your eyes. "Framing isn't rank," she replied politely. "It's clarity." He studied her, then leaned closer. "Careful," he whispered. "Clarity embarrasses people who like fog." She didn't answer. The CEO walked by, scanned the desk for exactly 2 seconds, and said to the girl, "Walk with me." The VP stepped back like the tide backing off the beach to reconsider its next move. They walked the floor once, not because the CEO liked tours but because he liked to see who was working and how. He didn't make conversation. He made observations. "People who talk loud at their desks aren't working," he said. "People who don't talk at all might be hiding. Learn the difference." He paused by the conference room and tapped the glass with one knuckle. Also, whiteboards. He pointed to a corridor-length panel filled with the past year's plans and notes. "Write only what you'd be proud to read in the newspaper and what you'd defend under oath." "Because leaks," she said. "Because character," he countered. "Leaks are a test. Character is the grade." They stopped by the window. The city below performed its endless show. Traffic steady as arteries. Cranes like settled insects on the shoulders of new buildings. People streaming between small and large doors to make and break and buy and sell and love and leave. "Do you miss it?" she asked before she could stop herself. "The beginning?" He didn't answer at first. He didn't look at her. He looked at the place that wasn't the skyline and wasn't the glass somewhere private in the middle, where people keep the things they can't inventory. "Sometimes," he said. "And what do you miss?" she asked, because she had learned that the right questions sometimes arrived without permission and sometimes made permission for themselves. He turned, one eyebrow almost amused. "You," he said. She blinked. "Me? The version of me that walked into a room without an invitation," he said, and thought the right sentence could change a day. She exhaled, a laugh and a breath tangled. "It can," she said softly. "It can," he agreed. He put a hand on the glass, as if remembering, then pulled it back, as if remembering something else. "Get back to work," he said. "The future is allergic to nostalgia." She did. She wrote the memo that vendors would read and understand. She caught the number that would have lied on slide 23. She built a protocol that treated people like people. She ate lunch. She called the clinic to confirm her mother's checkup on Friday afternoon and told the assistant she would make up the hour on Saturday morning. The assistant said, "You don't have to make up hours. You have to make up outcomes." The girl wrote that down too. On Thursday, the supplier sent the first photographic update. Ventilation installed. Heat shields added. Overtime tracked with a new system. The photos were blue-tinted proof that could be faked and might be real. The NGO's notes were the real report. Workers paid for the interviews. One woman cried. One man laughed like relief was a drink, and he was gulping it. Supervisors tried to watch until they were told they couldn't, and someone important stood in the door to make sure they didn't. The girl read the notes twice and then put the paper down and looked out the window the same way the CEO did when the glass was a mirror. On Friday, she took her mother to the clinic. The blood pressure readouts were better. The doctor adjusted a dosage and approved a stronger medication the girl could now actually afford. They stopped by a small cafe afterward and split a warm pastry, steam curling into the cool air like a benediction. "Do you like your niche?" her mother asked, the English word pronounced softly, as if it were a fragile cup. The girl thought about it. "My niche," she said, testing the shape of the word, "is turning noise into sentences that make people move." Her mother nodded, as if the answer had been planted in her daughter's mouth years ago and had finally bloomed. "That is a good job," she said. Saturday morning, the office was quieter, the air softer. The girl came in for 2 hours because there were outcomes to make and because it felt like a sacred thing to care enough to show up when no one was scoring. The assistant was there too, hair up, sleeves rolled. They worked in companionable silence until the assistant said without looking up, "You don't have to choose between being relentless and being human." "I know," the girl said. And she did. For the first time in a long time, she did. By the end of week 2, the forecast breathed without lying. The pledge began turning from words into forms and rooms and fans and rules. The CEO's pocket notes regained a line he had almost forgotten. Protect the truth. The numbers are the oxygen. He added a line beneath it in a quick, impatient hand. Protect the people. The numbers are for them. On Sunday evening, the girl sat by the window with the city humming in low gear and wrote Week 3. Teach the room how to breathe. It sounded grand. It wasn't. It meant catching the next wrong number before it put on a suit. It meant telling a vendor precisely what date their 90 days began and what day 91 would feel like if they chose not to move. It meant letting the assistant eat half a sandwich without being interrupted by a fire that had been burning quietly for 2 days because no one wanted to name it. It meant, most of all, remembering what her mother had said. You made a sentence that kept a person safe. She wanted a life full of those sentences. She wanted a building full of them. She wanted a world where the truth arrived fast enough that the lies never got comfortable. On Monday morning, she would walk back into the tower with the same shoes, the same notebook, the same face. But the building would be different because she knew where the levers were now. She didn't have to break doors anymore. She could turn handles. The elevator would open. The assistant would hand her a stack of things that looked like papers but were actually promises. The CEO would say something short that could be a warning or a blessing depending on how you carried it. The VP would test her with a smile. The city would do what cities do, devour and deliver. And the girl who had once slammed a crumpled resume on a desk and asked for work would do what she had learned to do. Not make speeches, not make noise, not make herself bigger. She would make the work better. She would name the truth sooner. She would hold the line where it mattered, even when it bent. Especially when it bent. Because the week that had changed everything hadn't given her a miracle. It had given her a path. She intended to walk it until it took her somewhere she didn't have to ask for the job anymore. She would write the job into the building's bones. And when the next desperate soul walked in without an invitation and asked for a chance, she intended to be the kind of person who could say yes without forgetting what yes used to feel like. The third week began without drama, which almost felt like a trap. No leaks, no frantic emails, no surprise calls from regulators or journalists. The 38th floor hummed at its usual frequency. Steady, fast, relentless. But beneath that rhythm, the girl sensed something different. She no longer felt like a visitor sneaking into a forbidden place. She belonged here now, and that belonging carried both weight and responsibility. Her badge opened the doors without hesitation. Her desk carried papers with her handwriting, not just borrowed notes. People greeted her by name, not by suspicious glances. The assistant, who had once bristled at her presence, now spoke to her in shorthand the way you do with people you trust to understand without explanations. And the CEO? He still rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. But when he did, those words were heavier than gold. On Monday morning, she received her first direct assignment from him without the assistant as intermediary. The message was short. Review expansion markets. Find the weak promises. 48 hours. She opened the file and felt the immensity of it: charts, projections, glossy optimism spilling across slides. Expansion always looked beautiful on paper. New cities, new regions, new revenue. But she had already learned the danger of pretty lies. She built a simple framework in her notebook. Promise. What the slide claims. Proof. What supports it. Weakness. What could break it. Cost of being wrong. What it will take to recover if this fails. Then she went line by line. Latin America. Strong potential, but distribution partners had histories of late payments. Promise fragile. Southeast Asia. Bright numbers, but regulatory landscape full of traps licenses that took years, not months. Promise dangerous. Europe. Saturated markets, competitors entrenched, but stability at least predictable. Promise safe, if unspectacular. By Tuesday night, she had condensed hundreds of pages into 6 slides. Each carried the same brutal honesty she had fought for since day one. Not the dream, not the nightmare. Just the truth. When she placed it on the CEO's desk the next morning, she said, "You asked for weak promises. These are the ones that crack first." He scanned them quickly, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he said, "You don't decorate." His sighed. "I don't know how," she admitted. "Good," he said. "Don't learn." The days that followed were less dramatic, but no less demanding. She was now part of the machinery catching errors before they multiplied, framing decisions before they spiraled, holding truths before they slipped away. The assistant pushed her harder, testing how much weight she could carry. Operations looped her into compliance calls. Finance trusted her summaries enough to quote them in meetings, and slowly, her presence became normal. The skeptical glances faded. The VP with the precise haircut still tested her, but each time she held her ground, each time she refused to bend the truth to optics, his smiles grew thinner. What changed most, though, was not the building. It was her. At night, she still returned to the small apartment, to her mother's fragile health and the constant worry of bills, but she no longer carried only desperation. She carried proof that she could stand in the storm and not break. Proof that her sentences could shift rooms full of power. Proof that the crumpled resume she had once slammed on a desk had been more than paper. It had been a declaration. One evening, weeks later, she found herself standing by the office window after most had gone home. The city glittered beneath her, endless, hungry, alive. She thought of the girl she had been that first day, fists trembling, voice cracking, demanding a chance. She thought of the CEO reading her resume, the assistant circling her mistakes, the battles over numbers, the nights she had gone home too tired to think but too alive to stop. The CEO stepped into the room quietly, as he always did, and stood beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "You've changed the way some people work here. You know that?" She shook her head. "I just do the job." "That's why," he replied. Silence again, comfortable this time. Then he added, "Don't lose it. Hunger, clarity, the sense that this matters. Most people trade those away for comfort or cynicism. Don't." "I won't," she said softly. He gave a single nod, then turned back toward his office. Later that night at home, she sat by her mother's bedside, recounting her day in simple words. Her mother listened, smiling faintly, and said, "You've built a place for yourself. Not given, built." The girl squeezed her mother's hand, eyes stinging. "Yes, built." And as she opened her notebook one last time before bed, she wrote across the page, "From nothing to something. From desperate to necessary. From the girl who begged to the woman who builds." She closed the book, turned off the light, and let herself rest. Tomorrow, the work would begin again. But for the first time in her life, she knew. The future was no longer a locked door. It was a hallway she had already stepped into,